There are two papers here. The first one is this paper, A Metatheory of Classical and Modern Connectionism. And the second one is this Rosetta Stone for Connectionism. It's a classic complexity theory paper, actually. And so there's this history of connectionism that is, I don't think we reflect on it enough. It was a fundamental part of early cognitive science. And, we use it like ubiquitously in a lot of the machine learning models that we use today. And, even in large language models, but we don't really reflect on what's going on in connectionism, what the theoretical claims are in connectionism, and some of those more philosophical and theoretical aspects of it. So the first thing, this is a quote from Margaret Bowden in this paper here. And so what's significant about this is that Margaret Bowden died recently. And she was a pretty big, heavy hitter in cognitive science, having written the book that Jesse always references about sort of the history in the different strands of cognitive science, which is, a very interesting topic. And this paper draws from Margaret Bowden's book in 2006, Mind as a Machine, The History of Cognitive Science, 2-volume set. So a lot of this paper draws from her work in that. So this paper is a meta-theory of classical and modern connectionism. This is Olivia Guest and Andrea Martin. And they talk about, so they want to frame connectionism sort of as this classical phenomenon and then this modern phenomenon. So it changes over time in terms of its aims and its goals. And when they say connectionism, they simply mean like these models where you have nodes and their connections, and those connections yield sort of patterns of processing that are correlational, that are associative, and they can be used in terms of modeling memory and modeling other cognitive aspects. In fact, they were invented as a way to model cognition in the brain. And, being very abstract models, they don't map to the brain in any specific way, but what they do produce is this sort of, these sort of outputs that maybe look like they are neural or something like that. So we start with the abstract. Contemporary AI models owe much of their success and discontents to connectionism, a framework in cognitive science that has been and continues to be highly influential. Herein, we analyze artificial neural networks, or ANNs, in a couple of different ways. The first is that when used as scientific instruments of study, and then when functioning as emergent arbiters of the zeitgeist in the cognitive, computational, neurosciences. We'll get into what that means later. Building on our previous work with respect to analogizing between artificial neural networks and cognition, brains, or behavior. So they wrote a work on this sort of analogy between artificial networks and cognition, artificial neural networks and brains, artificial neural networks and behavior. So this is an outstanding issue in cognitive science with connectionist models. How sort of reliable are they as analogies? And we've talked about in our group before about the machine analogy. So how much is biology like a machine? How much is the brain like a machine? How much is a computer like a brain? Things like that. We use meta-theoretical analysis techniques, including formal logic, to characterize two distinct tendencies within connectionism that we dub classical and modern, with divergent properties. So these different classical and modern eras have different goals, mechanisms, and scientific questions associated with them. So the classical Connectionism would be sort of the connectionism of maybe the 1980s when it first emerged. And then the modern connectionism is where it's been applied to machine learning and other types of technologies. Those are two very different application domains. And of course, the scientific questions are different, the goals are different, and so forth. We also demonstrate how we, as a field, often fail to follow important lines of argument to their end. This results in a paradoxical praxis. So this is where, people will often not follow through with their arguments. The field kind of evolves away from the original intent. So it's interesting. By engaging more deeply with meta-theories surrounding artificial neural networks, our field can obviate the cycle of AI winters and summers, which need not be inevitable. Okay, so this is the quote from Margaret Bowden. Connectionism was conceived almost 3 centuries ago, in the 1740s, but had a long gestation. In its embryonic form, it was merely biologized introspection. David Hartley's view of that thinking is grounded as associative mechanisms in the brain is the sort of the first appearance of connectionism, and just thinking about how thinking is related to the brain. So, according to Bowden, connectionism has been around in some form or another for almost 3 centuries. Even a more conservative estimate still places connectionism's beginnings in the 1940s, making it much older than the current technology industry-driven hype cycle in artificial intelligence research. Connectionism has gone through boom and bust cycles, so-called summers and winters. Thus, statements such as "we attend today an explosive infatuation for this once old style, but now new-fashioned view of cognition," which was from a paper by Bersini in 1989, wondrously are as applicable now as when they were written back then. In this paper, we aim to critique and juxtapose modern connectionist stances with those around prior to 2010, when it can be argued that classical pre-deep learning, pre-widespread GPU use era ended. So basically, their division line is about the year 2010. So the connectionism that was practiced before 2010 is classical. The connectionism practiced after 2010 is modern. And this is where we have our modern tools of deep learning, GPUs, and other types of tools that were different than the way connectionism was applied, especially in the 80s and 90s. Importantly, contemporary AI models owe much of their success and discontents to connectionism. And so there is this connection between sort of the summers and winters of AI as we know them historically, and connectionism and its successes and failures. So that's where they're going with this. We present a nuanced critical perspective on artificial neural networks when used as scientific instruments of study, such as computational models of brain and behavior, and used in fields like cognitive computational neuroscience. And this is used in contrast to when artificial neural networks are used as statistical and engineering methodologies. For example, in non-scientific engineering-oriented AI uses, notwithstanding there are important overlaps between the technology sector, which is driven by profits, and engineering and science. And so this results in important undesirable contradictions and in conflicts of interest. The analysis presented in this paper is centered on the idea that both critics and advocates, we as a field must follow important lines of argumentation to their logical conclusions. We examine the effects of the converse, for example, when we take defensive rhetorical positions too far, in discussing the scientific and engineering contributions of and purported capacities of artificial neural networks. we don't want to take positions away from sort of their grounding. To do this, we propose a bisection of the connectionist tendency into roughly pre-2010, which we dub classical connectionism, and abbreviate it to this symbol here, and then post-2010, which is modern connectionism, with this symbol here. So it's C&M, but stylized. Such a distinction accommodates a variety of related scientific events occurring as a function of so-called deep learning artificial neural networks becoming computationally feasible and accessible to many scientists around the world. So this is, again, I don't know, I think this might be a little bit of an artificial dividing line, because artificial neural networks, as they define them, were used in engineering well before 2010, and people were using ANNs as models of brain and cognition before 2010. I'm not really sure if that's a great dividing line, but whatever. So this shows sort of this Mark I perceptron, which was an early connectionist model. You have the retina, the retinal circuits, or the retinal units. You have sensory units here. This is supposed to be the sort of sensory inputs in a brain, but it's kind of represented as an engineering input. You have networks of random connections. These kind of map to association units or A units, and then those further map to this network of many-to-one connections with feedback loops. So these are response units. So you can see that you have the input, you have the association layer, or the association units, and then you have this response unit. So it's like input, hidden layer, output. It's that basic structure of a connectionist network. It's that basic structure of a neural network or an artificial neural network. And it's interesting because last week we talked about the work of Braitenberg and how his biological cybernetics enterprise worked. So he was interested in neuroanatomy, but he was also interested in Braitenberg vehicles. And so, Braitenberg kind of wanted to unite the two. So he wrote a lot of papers on neuroanatomy, sometimes very deep and informative papers on neuroanatomy, and then switched over into, I guess, later in his career, he started to find more and more commonality with these kind of computational models and the computational structure of a lot of the, like I said, insect nervous systems that he was studying. So it's a very different road to this than what they're describing here. He was taking biological systems and moving towards these artificial systems or these models. In this case, people are using biological inspiration very broadly to model these inputs and outputs. And then if we think about Braitenberg vehicles, which came later in Braitenberg's career, we know that this is basically the model that he used as well. And it doesn't really, map to this in the same way, but you had the inputs, sensory inputs, in this case visual inputs. You then have association units where you have maybe some mapping between the sensor and effector, and then you have the output or the effector, which is the simple command that goes out into the world. And you can have these feedback loops between the response units to fine-tune what's going on. And if you look at some of the vehicle designs that Braitenberg proposed, this is exactly the structure he proposed. And so it's interesting how, the early perceptrons, the early models of this kind of have this basic structure, which is biological, but it's extremely reduced biology and extremely reduced cognition. Okay, so that's, and so some people, this is kind of, this type of model inspired a lot of work. So the history of it, in compressing this down, because there's a lot of history here. This is the hardware artificial neural network built by Frank Rosenblatt. This is the Mark I perceptron. And so this is sort of a parallel structure to biological neural systems. And so you can see this where you're not really proposing any brain-like components, but you have this sort of information processing aspect of the nervous system that you're trying to replicate. And so it's interesting that this blurs the line between mechanistic and functional modeling. And, in the field, they use terms like microstructure of cognition, which was something Rumelhart coined in 1986, Rumelhart et al. And using this in a way that's sort of opposed to function approximation. So, we have connectionism, we have these models, and they're used for a lot of different types of sort of studies. So one of the things about connectionism is they're very diverse in terms of how you can use them. It's like kind of an all-purpose architecture that allows you to study a lot of different things or think about them in a lot of different ways. And so as a theory, it's kind of interesting because it gives you maybe a lot of potential predictions, but it's a very general architecture. I guess it's interesting about it is it's sort of quasi-universality, right? Like it's universal in the sense that it's capturing something in nervous systems or in the brain that exists, mainly this associative aspect, right? You have sensory inputs, they get associated with things, and then there's this output. And it can map to behaviors, or it can map to other types of perception. It's very general, and it's interesting how this is all kind of how this was applied, at least in this classical period. Okay, so before we can do any of this, what is connectionism as sort of a term? And as I mentioned already, this term is pretty general. I mean, it's just this idea of having these connections and having these associations that map to outputs. So according to Rumelhart et al. In 1986, it is the notion that intelligence emerges from the interactions of large numbers of simple processing units. So intelligence is basically the ability to make these associations internally and then map them to behaviors. So you could imagine, like, if you had sensory inputs through this retinal structure or through a bunch of sensors, those inputs might take different scenes from from the environment, where they might be overlapping scenes, they might be redundant scenes, and it maps them to all of the things that are associated in those fields. So it could be like a feature space, it could be, kind of merging the scenes together in terms of their common components, and then finding every possible association. And then using every possible association to produce coherent responses. So you have this sort of generative aspect where you have these sensory inputs, and you have then this association layer that's finding all the possible kind of interesting things or all the possible correlational relationships. And then it's reducing it down to these coherent outputs, which are maybe zeros and ones. They could be different behavioral responses, moving forward, moving backwards, anything like that. So it's a selection aspect at the back end. Okay, so this framework has been variously called parallel distributed processing, neural network modeling, or connectionism. And the term, so Donald Hebb, who worked on associative memory, he introduced the term connectionism in terms of the brain because he was doing a lot of things with associative learning and things like that, and discovered things that led to long-term potentiation and things like that. So most broadly, connectionism is the drawing of parallels between artificial neural network models and the brain and cognition, specifically using them to model neurocognitive systems or phenomena. Worthy of underlining here is that connectionist networks typically do not bear a transparent relation to the neurological structures that realize them. And so the description of connectionist networks as neural nets is somewhat misleading. So again, you think about like the work of Donald Hebb, thinking about associative memory, and then, thinking about the neurological structures underlying them. But then you think about connectionist networks being so abstract from that it's hard to really make that mapping. Now, like I said, there might be like, I could take the other case and say, like, if you look at the work of Braitenberg, he actually makes that connection a little bit more explicit. And so that's an interesting counterexample. Artificial neural networks is mathematical objects implemented on digital computers that involve banks of units, artificial neurons, grouped into layers that propagate activations to other banks of units, or recurrently back to themselves. And then you also have to have some sort of mathematical function to process them, is sort of the basis for these types of structures. So these structures are mathematical. They involve different banks of units, so things have to be discretized in a certain way. You have to group things into layers, which may or may not exist in the brain, but functionally the layers exist, or structurally the layers exist. And then you have these mathematical functions which operate sort of in a way that maybe action potentials might act, or multisensory integration might act, but doing this in a mathematically tractable way that's sort of universal or systematic. Okay, so learning is achieved, say for example, using backpropagation by changing the numerical value of the connection weights, artificial synapses between and within layers as a function of difference between the network's output behavior and some target state. For a schematic of hardware ANNs, the Mark I perceptron serves as a good example. And even in that nascent stage, such models resemble modern connectionist framings with respect to input, different types of neural structures. So your input units are retinal cells, your association units are, in what some people in neuroanatomy used to call association cortex, which is neocortex, and then response units, which are effectors in the, in the organism, which could be muscles, they could be something in the spinal cord, it could be something in the language production area. So there are a lot of ways to map these inputs and outputs and association mechanisms to the brain, but they're not explicitly neural. Okay, so I'm going to go through to this table here. These are the metatheoretical claims or commitments between classic connectionism, which they define as pre-2010, and modern connectionism, which is post-2010. And the idea is going to be to go through the goals, the questions, the theories, the mechanisms, the relation to the brain, and then the training that a network needs. And you're going to see that there are differences between these two eras, just citing papers from these two eras and how this has evolved over time. So the goal in classical connectionism is in understanding the repercussions of our theories. So, for example, models are tools for exploring the implications of ideas. So, again, you can use, say, in classical connectionism, you can use a connectionist model to understand different hypotheses you might have about the brain, or maybe more specifically about associative learning. And so in that sense, they're great tools because they give you this way to test hypotheses that you couldn't necessarily test by using like neuroimaging, or you could inform neuroimaging through these models. And in fact, in cognitive science, there's this rich history of using computational models to augment experiments. And in classic cognitive science, they didn't really have cognitive neuroscience. I mean, cognitive neuroscience relative to the split in 2010 is interesting because we had, say, like electrophysiology all throughout the history of cognitive science. But like things like fMRI didn't appear until maybe like the early 90s in any meaningful way. So it wasn't until the 90s that we started getting results from, say, like fMRI. We had EEG results earlier, but mapping those to the mind or mapping those to cognition was they were kind of disconnected almost. And so, people would use connectionist models to think about how the theory of cognition in terms of information processing mapped onto the brain in some way. Models are used to understand the theories within connectionism, which themselves are about understanding brain, cognition, and behavior. Additionally, a good fit never means that a model can be declared to provide the true explanation for the observed data. So this is where we have the model and we have the phenomena, and we have this goodness of fit, or this, this sort of realism where the model has to be, close or approximate the cognitive system. But however, if we do get a good fit, it should never be declared that that's the true explanation. So it just should inform the true explanation. It shouldn't take the place of a good explanation or of a true explanation. Now, in the post-2010 period, there's a difference in terms of how people are thinking about this. So these citations are from about 2018 to 2021. In this case, the goal of science is to be able to predict what systems are going to do. These artificial neural networks get us closer to the goal of neuroscience. And so when we say we understood a phenomena, first and foremost, that means that we can predict all the explainable variants in the data or any input in the domain over which the model is claimed to hold. So it's much more aggressively predictive in terms of how we can use ANNs to understand neuroscience, which is interesting because the theoretical sort of aggressiveness is increased over time with models. And maybe that's because you have better hardware, you have maybe more refined models or refined techniques, but also because we also have a lot more neuroimaging data available by 2010 and onward. Okay, so then the questions. So in classical connectionism, the questions, this question here, can the connectionist principles give rise to similar behavior in brain data or cognitive capacities as seen in humans? Okay, so basically, can connectionist models replicate the brain states or cognitive capacities of humans? And so no specific prediction requirements are imposed on the models. And anatomical mappings, if present, are baked in. The model is forwarded as a way to explore theory. That's from McClellan, 2009. And so that's kind of the way that they think about this. And then in the modern era, which is post-2010, the question is, can ANNs predict? Here used to mean correlate with behavioral or brain data. As such, they are used like inferential statistics or framed like theoretical models. So basically, you have a more aggressive predictive stance. And as a result, you're using inferential statistics and ANNs together to make these types of predictions. And then there's a Daniel Yeomans in this reference from 2021. Not only did we get good predictions, but there's a kind of anatomical consistency. So there's a claim that you can get better sort of synergy with neuroimaging data with, between these kind of models in the brain, etc. Then there's the theory. So in the classical era, theory is implemented by the model. The model is not a stand-in for theory. For example, we consider a simple computational implementation of the theory in which visual representations of objects and perceptual representations of verbal statements about these objects interact with one another by means of an intermediating semantic system. So we don't necessarily use the model as theory. We're just implementing theory in the model. So if we have an artificial neural network in the classical era, that model usually models a theory. We have a theory about the brain. We have a theory of cognition, how it occurs in the brain. We build the model. We run the model. And if the model fits the data, available data, either cognitive or neuroimaging, then our modeling exercise has been a success. If not, we go back and refine our model, but we never necessarily go back to refine our theory. Sometimes we'll refine our theory, but we also have to refine the model. In the modern era, in terms of theory is the model. So theory is instantiated in task-performing computational models. So basically, the model is the theory. They're not separated. It's, you're not using the model to sort of represent the theory. That's actually the theory. That's from the citation in 2018. Additionally, theorizing is often inspired by engineering systems, not nature directly. Current computational neuroscience practice looks to AI, which has historically provided a fund of ideas for biological theories. So, yeah, this is sort of the idea that sort of there's a stronger connection between models and theory, and then using these kind of models to, kind of feel, maybe if you're doing something like computational neuroscience, using these models to fill in the gaps. There's this basically this lament in neuroscience that neuroscience doesn't have theories, which is probably not true, but that's kind of, that also plays into this a little bit, is that neuroscience doesn't have theories the way physics does or the way biology sometimes does. And so it's like there's a lot of data generated, but very little theory to interpret it. I'm not sure if I agree with that, but this kind of speaks to the idea that theory is basically being supplanted by models. And it's an interesting kind of thing to reflect on, I think. So in terms of mechanisms are proposed, which the model embodies, and experiments are done to show proof of concept. So one example of this is can connectionist principles give rise to phenomena and or capacities of interest. The artificial neural network allows us not just to probe the response to a given stimulus test. So, you might model some sort of cognitive experiment where you want to see what the underlying neural response is. And I put that in quotes because, again, we're not looking at the brain directly. We're looking at this connectionist model. But also to ask questions about the nature of the existing representations the model has learned. So we can actually think about cognitive representations using that kind of model. And again, this is the classical view. So they were very much interested in hypothesis testing and then having things that you could actually probe. And again, this was all sort of maybe semi-independent of of neuroimaging. Okay, and then in the modern era, the mechanism is as follows. The model is assumed to be equivalent in some way to a cognitive or neural system, and experiments are done to support this assumption. The core idea is to treat an artificial neural network as a participant in a psychology experiment in order to tease out the system's mechanisms of decision-making, reasoning, cognitive biases, and other important psychological traits. So this is basically where you can probe the artificial neural network and treat it kind of like a cognitive entity that you can explore, which is interesting, and it kind of follows from the classical view. The classical view being a little bit more, self-aware about ANNs being models. In this case, you're almost saying that, well, the ANN can take on the properties of an experimental participant, which I don't know if that's necessarily the case. I guess, you could criticize that view, but you probably also then want to criticize the classical view, as it seems like it's just kind of the evolution of that view, but whatever. Then there's the brain. So linking this back to the brain, linking this back to the neuroimaging and the neuroscience, brain regions, if related to models, are presented as being modeled, not as uncovered correlationally. Theory, or some knowledge to be modeled, understood. System comes first, and these ideas are placed into an artificial neural network, modeled purposefully. So it's about like basically modeling different brain regions. And so that associative layer is modeled. We know kind of what we want in the model, and we put those features in, and then we see if it matches our, we run the model and see if it matches our theory or our hypotheses. So I guess the point here is that you're not uncovering anything necessarily new. And that's interesting because then the modern view is that computational models can help infer the function of brain regions by linking model and brain activity. Multi-layered models are particularly promising in this regard because their layers can have systematically mapped to brain regions. So this is also interesting because this modern era is defined by deep learning architectures. So if we think about like classical artificial neural networks of the 80s and 90s, they didn't have a lot of layers. It's just like we had this associative layer, and then we had the inputs, associative layer outputs. Later on in this modern era that they define, you have deep learning models, deep learning representations, which have many hidden layers. And you can do things in those layers. You can refine, so you have many, many different associative layers. And so you can refine things can, they can sort of act as different brain regions. So you can basically have a network of brain regions within the same model. But then their claim is more about like discovering things within the models that are analogous to discovering things within the brain, and doing things that are similar to neuroimaging. So this is quite interesting from the standpoint of discovery, and one might argue maybe there's a little bit of delusion in this, in that you have this, is there real, or what are you really discovering? Are you discovering things that are being generated like the brain generates them, or are you just discovering things that are you just discovering things that are epiphenomena? Okay, so then finally, training. There is often explicit awareness of the possibility for behaviorist or associationist stance and the load placed on the training regime and set. which in the case of artificial neural networks is statistics in the input. So, for example, don't pre-wire structure into your mechanism if it can get it for free from the environment. So this is where there's this aspect of, I don't want to say nature versus nurture, but there's this interesting aspect of model complexity and sort of the inherent complexity of the model. So, of course, these models were not that, their computational overhead wasn't that great because A, we didn't have the computers to simulate them, but B, they were supposed to be simple sort of toy models of a brain or of a mind. And so you wanted to see what you could get out of the environment so that you could see how those things from the environment were being processed as information. So you didn't want to pre-wire a bunch of structures into your mechanism. You just wanted to see if the environment could shape like a generic connectionist array or an associative array. So that was the thinking. And of course, this plays into a lot of things like the nature versus nurture debate and other aspects of how, thinking about different brain regions and defining different brain regions and, how they're represented in the brain and so forth. So there are a lot of sort of parallel arguments within cognitive science and neuroscience that come into play here. So that was the classical view. And then the modern view kind of follows up on that. Claims about statistics in the inputs, the proverbial ghost in the machine, are downplayed. So this is this idea of the ghost in the machine, where you have inputs, you have these correlations in the inputs that you see through associative learning that could be spurious correlations. So we don't know if these correlations mean anything. You can discover correlations that might be spurious and maybe don't relate to anything behavioral. But maybe they do relate to something behavioral. It's a black box in that sense. The model's depth or architecture generally is taken as the important factor. So, what I said before about the ghost in the machine was that you can have these spurious correlations, these outputs that are maybe not, there are these patterns that are really not relevant in terms of outputs. And that's true. And what they've tried to do in the modern era is overcome that with depth and larger architectures. And so that's where you get this important aspect. So in these larger models, you might pre-wire structure into the model. You can certainly simulate the pre-wired structure. And you have a wider range of relationships with model complexity and with the environment. So the training set is not implicated in argumentation, except to say it comprises realistic stimuli. And so, again, our training set can be much more realistic. In a classical connectionist view, your inputs are very simple. In fact, they might resemble the retina, where you just have simple stimuli that hit the retina, and then you try to figure out what the sort of the statistical structure of those signals are, and then how those relate to the output. In the modern era, we have these much more complex models, much more computationally sophisticated models, and we can then, as a result, have much more sophisticated training data and much more. So I don't want to get into the paper anymore. I think it's a good paper that really kind of goes very deep into the philosophy, and it makes this distinction between classical connectionism and modern connectionism. I don't think all of it is warranted, but that's the way they divide these two up, and it's really interesting stuff. But I think what's relevant is that they mention in this paper another paper. And this paper is an older paper from 1990, so it's in this classical era. squarely within this classical era, but it's also related to complexity theory. And J. Dwayne Farmer worked at the Santa Fe Institute. I'm not sure if he's still around, but he was an early Santa Fe Institute person. And he wrote this paper in Physica D, 1990, called a Rosetta Stone for Connectionism. And so this is kind of in this classical era where they're thinking about artificial neural networks, and they're thinking about this aspect of connectionist architectures, which is the associative layer, right? So you're getting inputs, you have this associative layer, you have outputs. And it was seen as this sort of novel tool of cognitive science, this novel tool of computational neuroscience. And then that paradigm has moved into the modern era with a lot of the artificial intelligence stuff. But this paper actually takes a sidetrack from that and talks about sort of the structure of connectionism, this sort of universal structure of information processing, as something that is more general to other types of models of, maybe nature-inspired models or biologically inspired models. So the abstract here, he says, the term connectionism is usually applied to neural networks. There are, however, many other models that are mathematically similar, including classifier systems, immune networks, autocatalytic chemical reaction networks, and others. In view of the similarity, it is appropriate to broaden the term connectionism. I define a connectionist model as a dynamical system with two properties. So we have this dynamical system which takes inputs, and in a dynamical system you're describing some function of which a system will move. So you're describing some trajectory in a phase space. So instead of describing the connections and those statistical aspects, you're describing the statistics of, say, a trajectory or set of trajectories in a space that is maybe much like a latent space that we see in machine learning models, which is that associative layer. So I define a connectionist model as a dynamical system with two properties. The first is that the interactions between the variables at any given time are explicitly constrained to a finite list of connections. And then two, the connections are fluid and that their strength and or pattern of connectivity can change with time. So the first point is that you have these interactions that you're capturing. You have them constrained to a finite list of connections, so you're able to trace the trajectory through those that connection space. But then those connections are also fluid, so they're not deterministic. And over time, those things can change. So as your input changes, your associative layer changes its connectivity, and that changes the output. So it's not a deterministic system, and which is maybe the key to associative learning, is that it's not fully deterministic. It may be quasi-deterministic in that if I have a certain input, I might be able to say, well, this is the set of connections that we should see. And then we'd have an output set of behaviors. But the real power of connectionism, or specifically this associative layer, is that it isn't deterministic at all. It's a dynamical system, meaning it changes over time. And then, according to some function. And then it also has this sort of itinerance. So things get activated, things die down, the weights change over time, and for different time periods, you have different weight matrices. So there's this fluidity of connections. Okay, so this paper reviews the 4 examples listed above and maps them into a common mathematical framework, discussing their similarities and their differences. It also suggests new applications of connectionist models, imposes some problems to be addressed, and an eventual theory of connectionist systems. So an interesting aside to this as well, of course, this is 1990, and the first artificial life conference, I think, was 1988. So this is like around the time of artificial life too, in terms of conferences. And of course, the Santa Fe Institute is very interested as they continue to be in artificial life. So artificial life is a little bit different than artificial intelligence. It kind of thinks about how do you simulate life. And so that's that broader perspective here. So like in terms of connectionism, we're not just thinking about like a neural network in terms of modeling cognition or modeling the brain. We're thinking about neural networks maybe in terms of being a subclass of a larger class of networks that model biological systems. So yes, the same criticisms hold true for these other types of models. So for example, if you're modeling immune networks, you're using a network model to model the immune system, to model interactions. That may be, the mathematically most tractable way to do it, but it's not an immune network. It's not an immune system. You're abstracting away from that system to describe aspects of that system. Maybe it's the way in which that system operates. Maybe it's, how information is processed, whatever. So a lot of the same issues here with connectionism, seen in the light of a larger swath of biology. So one of the purposes of this paper is to identify a common language across several fields in order to make their similarities and differences clearer. A central goal is that practitioners in neural nets, classifier systems, immune nets, and autocatalytic nets will be able to make correspondences between work in their own field as compared with others, more easily importing mathematical results across this interdisciplinary space or disciplinary boundaries. This paper attempts to provide a coherent statement of what connectionist models are and how they differ in mathematical structure and philosophy from conventional fixed dynamical systems models. So this is a special class of dynamical systems model. I hope that it provides a first step towards clarifying some of the mathematical issues needed for a generally applicable theory of connectionist models. So this is actually taking this idea of how connectionist models are this universal type model for information processing and cognition and expanding it out even more to other types of systems. Okay, so if we go to connectionism here, connectionism describes this type of model that consists of elementary units which can be connected together to form a network. The form of the resulting connection diagram is often called the architecture. The computations performed by the network are highly dependent on the architecture. Each connection carries information in its weight, which specifies how strongly the two variables it connects interact. So any two nodes are two variables. That connection then is the weight in term that describes its relative interaction. Since the modeler has control over how the connections are made, the architecture is plastic. This contrasts with the usual approach in dynamics and bifurcation theory, where the dynamical system is a fixed object and its variability is concentrated into a few parameters. The plasticity of the connections and connection strengths mean that we must think about the entire family of dynamical systems described by all possible architectures and all possible combinations of weights. And so in this kind of model, we have 3 levels at least of dynamics. So when we have a dynamical system, we're describing some set of dynamics. In this case, we're describing multiple dynamics at different levels of the model. So we're looking at the states of the network. We're looking at the values of connection strengths. And then we're looking at the architecture of connections themselves. And so the structure of mathematical models is not actually unique to neural networks. You see them in other types of networks. you see them as kind of like analogies to those kind of networks. And so it has broad applicability. Okay. And then let's see if we can get into the mathematics. So they make significant use of a directed graph, creating a connection list. You have dynamics. And so, in conventional dynamic models, the form of the dynamical system is fixed. And as we discussed, this is different from what we need in this case. So we have this plasticity. So alternatively, we can think of parameters as knobs that can be slowly changed in the background. In reality, the quantities that we incorporate as parameters are usually aspects of the system that change on a time scale slower than those we are modeling with the dynamical system. Connectionist models extend this view by giving the parameters an explicit dynamics of their own, and in some cases by giving a list of variables and their connections and a dynamics of its own. Typically, this involves a separation of timescales. The fast scale dynamics, which changes the states of the system, are usually associated with short-term information processing, which is termed the transition rule. The intermediate scale dynamics changes the parameters and is usually associated with learning. I would call this the parameter dynamics or the learning rule. So we have a transition rule and a learning rule. On the longest time scale, the graph itself may change. I would call this the graph dynamics. The graph dynamics may also be used for learning. So you have the transition rule, the learning rule, and then the graph dynamics, which can change. And so, again, we think of this system as this dynamical system with multiple timescales. And talking about the information that resides on a graph. And then, since the representation of the graph is intrinsically discrete, the graph dynamics usually has a different character. Often, as in classifier systems, immune networks, or autocatalytic networks, the graph dynamics contains random elements. In other cases, it may be a deterministic response to statistical properties of the node states or the connection states. Dynamical systems with graph dynamics are sometimes called metadynamical systems. So in all models discussed here, the states of the system reside on the nodes of the graph. The states are denoted as x of I, where I is an integer labeling the node. The parameters reside at either nodes or connections. Theta I refers to a node parameter residing at node I. Wij refers to a connection parameter residing at the connection between node I and node J. So this describes connection strength. This is an important part of connectionist models. And then, of course, we have these connection parameters and node parameters. And then in some cases, such as B-cell immune networks, this provides the only means of changing the average connection strength. Thus, it is misleading to assume that the connection parameters are equivalent to the connection strengths, since the connection strength of any given instant may vary depending on the states of the system, and since the form of the dynamics may differ considerably in different models, we need to discuss connection strength in terms of a quantity that is representation independent, which is well defined for any dynamical model. So that's where he introduces this Jacobian. When the transition rule is an ordinary differential equation of this form, the instantaneous connection strength of the connection from node I to node J, where I is an input to J, is the corresponding term in the Jacobian matrix here. So this is the Jacobian matrix. This is the transition rule in an ODE. And then a connection is excitatory if the Jacobian matrix is larger than 0, and inhibitory if it's less than 0. Similarly, for discrete time dynamical systems or continuous maps of this form here, a connection is excitatory if the Jacobian is larger than 1, and inhibitory if the Jacobian is smaller than And in a continuous system, the average connection strength is the Jacobian, where brackets denote an appropriate average. In this discrete system, it is the absolute value of the average Jacobian. To make this more precise, it is necessary to specify the ensemble over which the average is taken. Okay, so this just kind of talks about this. And then it gets into machine learning problems in neural networks, and it makes some point. There are several reasons for dropping the constraints of modeling real neurons. One is we do not understand the behavior of real neurons. Two, even if we understood them, it would be computationally inefficient to implement the full behavior. Three, it is unlikely we need the full complexity of real neurons in order to solve problems in machine learning. And then four, by experimenting with different approaches to simplified models of neurons, we can hope to extract the basic principles under which they operate and discover which of the properties are truly essential for learning. So this gets into more about characterizing neurons. But of course, if we want to use these other models, if we want to use, say, like we want to look at immune networks or something like that, we're not modeling neurons anymore necessarily. We're modeling the nodes as something else. And so we need to have a mathematical model of that. So there's a lot of really good modeling work in this paper, thinking about networks in different ways, thinking about the properties of connectionism in different ways, and all of that.